Hey everybody, today's video is called I Maintain My Innocence, and tonight we continue our Passthrough study here in the book of Job, where we're going to be looking at Job proclaiming his innocence and purity. And so today's chapter, we're going to see Job gets a little more tense. He's more forceful in his pursuit of being cleared of the false allegations made by his friends. And Job, he demands justice in today's chapter. So chapter 31, and just a heads up, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video. We have over 40 verses to cover and other parts to the video. So chapter 31, verse 1 through 4, it says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above, and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked, and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? So verses 1 through 4 here, Job speaks right off in verse 1 on the word purity. He says, why then should I look upon a young woman? I have made a covenant with my eyes. So right off the bat, Job says that he has purity toward women. And he declares that he was determined not to sin with his eyes. And some believe that this points at the rebuking of the worship of the fertility goddess so popular in the time period of the Old Testament. Some call Job's chapter here Job's Sermon on the Mount, as he covers many of the same issues of spiritual ethics as Jesus covered in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. And Job teaches that the eyes are the gateway for lust, especially for men. And we got to be straightforward. As men, it is a struggle for us. But when men place enticing sensual lust, inducing images before their eyes, it's a form of foreplay, especially considering that it often leads to some kind of level of sexual arousal within the man. And Job's ability to control himself was connected through the covenant that he had made between himself. And he made a vow, he made a promise and a commitment not to look upon a young woman in a sinful way to God. And the first step for us to seek purity with our eyes is to say, God, help me with this. God, I want to focus on you. I don't want to focus on what this world has to offer. And rich and powerful men in this culture were known to seduce maidens and then add them as wives and concubines. I mean, we know that in David's time, he had 700 wives, 300 wives, 700 concubines, or vice versa. In Job, he restrained himself from women that others in the same circumstances would not have been able to restrain themselves from. And in Leviticus 18, it shows us the nakedness of an individual belongs to that individual and their spouse and not anyone else. And it doesn't matter what the world or society teaches as right or moral. The world has, society overall does not know what morality is. They don't care about morality. And it doesn't matter what the world or society teaches or practices. When you take that step to look at things that are going to trap you down a darker road, such as pornography, you take something that doesn't belong to you. And men, when you look at the nakedness of a woman that's not your wife, you take something that doesn't belong to you. And ladies, vice versa. If you look at the nakedness of men, you take something that doesn't belong to you. And you may say, but women don't do that. And we often have a stereotype that pornography is only a man issue. But Project No of American Addiction Centers did a study just recently, back in October 2023, that shows 76% of females that did this survey between the ages of 18 and 30 years old watch pornographic material. And maybe that number is fluttered high. Maybe they just ran a bad survey and targeted a certain group of people. But I think that's very telling that over 3/4 of women between 18 and 30 have admitted to struggle with pornography material. In Job's day had pornography, but not as accessible as pornography is today. Job didn't have technology. He didn't have gadgets, iPads, phone, cell phone. He didn't have computers, so on and so forth. And what we must realize is that our spouse is our inheritance of the Almighty from high. And Job considered the destructive nature of allowing oneself to be aroused by alluring images. And lust and sexual sin, it destroys lives. And as a world who rejects biblical purity, we are in trouble today. And in 1500 AD, man's economic dependence was 16 years old. 16 was the average age that a man would leave his household and become, married, so on and so forth. Today, it's about 26 years old. In 1500, men married at the average age of 18. And personally, me, I was very uncommon in modern society. I married at 19 back in 2010. In 2023, the average age of getting married for a man now is 30.2 years old. 20 years ago, just 20 years ago, it was 28. So we see that number rising as everybody puts their focus on education and all that. In 1500, male puberty was approximately 20 years of age. Today, puberty is happening even earlier. At 9 to 14 years old is the average puberty range. And there's many factors believed for this to be taking place, such as childhood obesity, chemicals in our food supply, chemicals in our personal products, and most commonly stress and anxiety. So there's different factors on why puberty is happening earlier in our development. How does Job have self-control against lust? He says because he knew that God was watching him. And that is the first thing that we must take note of, that God is watching you when you decide if you're going to give in to your temptation or not. So, to continue here, verse 5 through 8. If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity, if my step has turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. So Job, besides talking about purity, he clears himself of having extreme greed in his business dealings. And in verse 6, he declares his integrity not in an assertion of sinless perfectionism, but of genuine integrity and honesty. And he therefore doesn't shrink from being weighed in God's balance. And the penalty that Job sees as appropriate is a curse, a reversal and frustration of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 30 through 41 that covers. In verse 9 through 12, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity, deserving of judgment, for that would be a fire that consumes to destruction, and would root out all my increase. So Job, he goes on to declare himself of idolatry. And if he had violated another man's wife, then a curse should come upon his own marriage. And grinding grain is viewed as a most lowly of task in this period of time. And Job acknowledges that adultery is such a serious offense that it merits the sanctions of human and divine justice. And Job insisted that if he had been unfaithful in heart or action toward his wife, then he would deserve to have his wife taken from him and given to another. And many men who fail themselves under oppressive alimony or child support payments because they allowed their hearts to be enticed by another woman can attest the statement. They lived the statement, root out all my increase. In verse 13 through 15, if I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they have complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? So we see Job clears himself of injustice with respects to his servants. And if Job had rejected his servants' claims for fair treatment, he would have no grounds for complaining about God's treatment of him. And Job, he disregarded the class structures of his society and recognizes the basic equality before God of master and servant alike. And Proverbs 22 verse 2 says that the rich and poor have a common bond, that the Lord is maker of them both. And so Job, he showed a heart for holiness and ethical living, as would later clearly be spoken of in the New Testament, as we're going to see in our wrap-up. In Job, he treated his servants well, as he recognized their humanity, uncommon in the day of servants or slaves, were subhuman to those who have served. And as I say to people all the time right now, I don't care what others' opinions are, because this is how I feel. Our current world with corporations have that same mindset. They don't treat their employees well, unless they're executive branch of their company. But we'll keep on driving on here before I get myself into trouble. So verse 16 through 23 says, if I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat of it, but from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I've guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw I had hope in the gate, then my arm fall from my shoulder. Let my arm be torn out from the socket, for destruction from God is a terror to me, because of the magnificence I cannot endure. So Job, he clears himself of the neglect of the needy and abuse of the helpless. In Job, he avoided social injustice, because he dreaded the penalty that God would rightly impose on it. In verse 24 through 28 says, if I have made gold my hope, and said to the fine gold, you are my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gained much, if I have observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, this also would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. So these are some pretty hard words to swallow from Job today. But Job, he cleared himself from idolatry with regard to gold or the gods. And though Job enjoyed considerable affluence, he had not made it his source for confidence and living. And worship of the sun and moon was widely practiced throughout the ancient Near East at this time period. And the kissing of one's hand was recognized devotional gesture in the ancient Near East, as seen back in 1 Kings 19:18 and Hosea chapter 13 verse 2. And Job, he didn't partake in what society partook of in this time period with the worship of the sun and moon. And if Job wrote this before the other books of the Bible, it would have required natural revelation or conscience to know idolatry was sinful, as it was to deny God his rightful worship by worshiping this other being. And so verse 29 through 34 says, if I have rejoiced in the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him, indeed I have not allowed my mouth to sin, by asking for a curse on his soul. If the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I have opened the doors to my traveler. If I have covered my transgressions as Adam, but by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept silence and did not go out of the door. So we see that Job clears himself of hatred, selfishness, and hypocrisy. Job had not harbored hostile attitudes towards those who opposed him. And members of Job's household looked out for those who would benefit from Job's benevolence, including travelers passing by. In verse 33 says, if I have covered my transgressions as Adam. Adam in verse 33 is best to be taken as mankind. And I know I posted on it last week. I can't remember the exact date, but I talked about the Adam, and Adam represents human form, as in Hosea chapter 6 verse 7. And Job hasn't covered up his transgressions. He hasn't even avoided people out of fear of public opinion. And Job was a man after God's own heart, not taking pride when his enemies suffered and had been destroyed. And Job was kind of like God's mindset in Ezekiel 33:11, when it says God takes no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked. In verse 35 through 37, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. I would have declared to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. So Job wished for God, the perfect prosecutor who knows the allegations perfectly, had written a book that had revealed the will of God and wisdom and the reasons for what's taken place in Job's life with his pain. And this would have cleared him of all the charges that were raised by his friends. And Job thought here that God owed him answers, but we're going to see as we wrap up the book here in just a few weeks, chapter 42, verse 5 and 6, we're going to see that God has answers revealed then, that Job will repent. In verse 38 through 40, to wrap up the chapter here, like I said, it's a long video today. It says, if my land cries out against me, and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or cause its owners to lose their lives, then let the thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. So Job, again, denies that he has ever abused his position as a wealthy landowner. In the three cycles of these speeches, which began all the way back in Job chapter 3, we looked at, I think, Thanksgiving week or the week before, are finished. And Job had the first and the last word among his friends. But Job's not out of the picture yet. He's still got a troublemaker that's coming up that we're going to be looking at for the next few weeks. So to wrap up our study today, we see Job proclaim tonight of his purity and innocence as he pled not guilty of lust. And I want to look at the Sermon on the Mount. I know I referenced Job's Sermon on the Mount, but we're going to look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew chapter 5. And so Matthew chapter 5, verse 28-29 says, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And it is a fact that it is not easy for men to make a covenant with their own eyes. And there are cultural temptations among us. But we need to make, I won't say a vow, but we need to take a stand and tell ourselves that we want to honor God. And yes, there's plenty of temptation out there today. Women's clothing is meant to be more revealing than ever before. And like dress codes don't exist anymore. Technology today allows secretive sin of men. People like technology. We like our social media and all that, but it's a dangerous slope. It allows a secret life that sometimes goes unexposed, or over time will become exposed, and the damage is done. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Romans 12, 1 and 2, it says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove that what is good and acceptable, perfect will of God. So obedience to God in purity is a wonderful sacrifice made to God, and present our bodies as the living sacrifice to Him, not being conformed to this world. So no matter what the world chases and what the world goes after, we need to take that stand that we're going to be the living sacrifice. We are not going to be of this world. We are going to be outside of this world. We're going to live in this world, but not be of the norm of the world. And so verses 5 through 8 in today's chapter, it shows that Job was not guilty of falsehood. Verse 9 through 12 shows that Job claims to not be an adulterer. And allowing your heart to be enticed is a choice. It all starts with a choice. In verse 13 through 15 shows that Job didn't treat his servants with cruelty. Ephesians chapter 6. In verse 9, it says here, and you masters do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So the Apostle Paul also taught that if you have people under you, masters, to treat their servants well. In verse 16 through 23, it shows that Job didn't victimize the poor or the weak. In verses 24 through 28, it shows that Job was not a greedy person or a seeker of false gods. Verse 29 through 34 shows that Job was generally without blame. And we see that Job didn't react toward his enemies, wishing harm on them or seeking to get vengeance. He didn't show cursing to his enemies. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gave the same, call. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, starting out. It says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and prosecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So as Christians, we don't need to seek vengeance against our enemies. We need to love our enemies and pray for them. Verse 35 through 37, Job showed demand an audience with God. And verse 38 through 40 is a wrap-up. It concludes the 3 cycles with the ending of Job's words. So we'll see you next, as we'll be looking at a new introduction, hearing from another person wrapped up in the circus named Elihu. So that will be announced to come. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you for hanging in. I hope that today was a challenge. Hopefully somebody will say ouch and seek to get right with God and, to grow in their walk, to be living sacrifices to Christ. So God bless. We'll see you next time.